In this lesson, we're going to do some background review work on Introduction to Chemistry. So when we look at chemistry, chemistry is the science that deals with the materials of the universe and the changes that these materials undergo. In other words, we're talking about what makes up matter and how matter interacts with other types of matter. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just in a chemistry classroom. Chemistry is all around us. When we talk about wood burning, that's an example of a chemical reaction. It's the combustion of a hydrocarbon to produce carbon dioxide and water. When we talk about plants growing, that's also an example of chemistry. There are a lot of biochemical processes that take place inside plants that enable them to grow. When we deal with iron rusting, that's a chemical process in which iron reacts with oxygen to produce iron oxide. Lots of things that occur in our kitchens are examples of chemistry as well. Like when we bake breads, we are actually carrying out chemical reactions. And things that occur inside our bodies are all biochemical processes that enable us to grow and to repair ourselves and to keep us in energy supply. Now, when we deal with science is basically a process that occurs in which we state problems and go through a particular method to come up with probable solutions. And that process is called the scientific method. And the scientific method is broken up into several steps. The first step of the scientific method is to state what the problem is. You're not going to be studying something if you don't know what it is that you're trying to study. Once the problem is stated, then observations are collected and data is collected so that an informed idea about what the probable solution to our problem might be. And that probable solution is called a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess about what the answer to a particular problem is. Now, once we've stated a hypothesis, then experiments are performed. And while experiments are being performed, more observations are made. And those observations can include measurements that are made with instruments as well as observations that are made with our senses. And along with making observations, oftentimes performing experiments leads to developing scientific laws. And when we look at scientific laws, they are basically summaries of what was observed during a particular experiment. As an example, you've got the law of conservation of mass, which states that mass is conserved during any type of process. Now, another thing that can occur is the development of a theory. And a theory is a little bit different than a law, because a theory is a set of tested hypotheses that give an overall explanation of behavior. So whereas a law is just a summary, a theory is an explanation. Now, once a theory is developed, the experiment doesn't stop. Continual experiments are done to either prove or disprove theories. And sometimes theories have to be modified after continual experimentation is done. Now let's look at some important terms that we're going to be using throughout the year. The first term that we're going to deal with is what's called matter. And when we look at matter, matter is defined as anything that has mass and volume. So let's define those two terms. Mass is a measure of the amount of matter that's in an object. We could also say that it's the measure of the resistance of an object to a change in its state in motion. We measure the mass of an object on a balance, and in our classroom we're going to be using electronic balances to measure our masses. And our units for mass will be in grams. When we deal with volume, volume is the amount of space that an object occupies. And there are several ways that we can measure the volume of an object. If we're talking about a liquid, we can use a piece of glassware called a graduated cylinder. Since liquids take the shape of the container that you put them in, we add the liquid to the graduated cylinder and read the volume off of that cylinder. and our units would be milliliters. If we have a regular shaped object, we can use our geometric equations to calculate the amount of space or the volume of an object. Oftentimes, though, we have objects that are solids and don't have a regular shape, and we need to measure their volume. So we would use a process called displacement of water. And in this case, we would take a graduated cylinder, fill it with a known amount of water, add the object, and find out how much the water level rises or is displaced by that object. And that would give us the volume of our object. Now in lab, we make lots of observations, and we're going to categorize observations in two ways. The first type of observation is called a qualitative observation. And when we deal with qualitative observations, these are observations that do not require any kind of measurements. So saying that an object is a liquid, or it's red, or it's warm, are examples of qualitative observations because no measuring devices were used to make them. The other type of observation we have is called a quantitative observation. And when you look at that, you actually see the word quantity in it. Quantitative observations are observations that require measurements. So they will have numbers and units to go along with them. Like saying that an object has a mass of 5.00 grams or a density of 1.00 grams per milliliter are examples of quantitative observations. And we'll be doing both qualitative and quantitative observations in our labs this year. When we talk about the labs that we do and we collect quantitative observations, one of the things we'll discuss about our observations is precision. And when we deal with precision, precision is the degree of agreement among several measurements. So if we mass an object 5 times, how close are those 5 measurements? That would be precision. Now we'll also describe accuracy. And when we look at accuracy, we're dealing with the degree of agreement of a particular value with the accepted value. Like we have an object that we know has a mass of 200 grams, and we put it onto the balance, and we measure the mass, and it tells us that the mass is 190 grams. Comparing that measured value to the actual value will determine the accuracy of that measurement. So let's look at these dartboards. If we look at the first dartboard, we have darts that are scattered all around the dartboard. And what that's a demonstration of is a measurement that's neither precise nor accurate. If we're trying to hit the bullseye, none of those darts hit the bullseye, so it's not accurate. And the darts are all over the board, so there's no consistency, so it's not precise. If we look at the second dartboard, none of the darts hit the bullseye, so we're not accurate. But all of the darts are in about the same place on the board, so it is precise. If we look at the last dartboard, all of the darts are in the same general location, so that shows precision or reproducibility. And they're all hitting the bullseye, so that shows us that we're being accurate. When we talk about error, there are 2 basic types of error that we're going to be involved with this year. The first type is called random error. And it's just that. It's error that can be high or low, kind of all over the place, and random. As opposed to systematic error. And when we talk about systematic error, that's error that occurs in the same direction every time. So let's use an example. Let's say that we have a balance, and the balance is not calibrated correctly. Okay, let's say that the balance is off by 5 grams. That means that every time we put an object on that balance, it's going to be off by that same 5 grams. And that would be an example of a systematic error. Let's look at a couple of units that we're going to deal with this year. When we talk about mass, our units will be kilograms. When we deal with length, the fundamental unit is meters. Our fundamental unit for time is seconds. Our fundamental unit for temperature is called Kelvin, And we'll be dealing with what that unit of Kelvin means as we go through the year. We will deal a little bit with electric current this year, and our fundamental unit for electric current is amps. And when we talk about the amount of substance that we're dealing with, we're going to be looking at a unit that's probably the least familiar to you, and that unit is called a mole. We also want to be familiar with some prefixes that are used in the metric system. And we're not going to look at all of them, but we'll look at some of them. So when we talk about kilo, kilo means we've got 10 to the third, or 1,000. So if we talk about a kilometer, 1 kilometer equals 1,000 meters. If we talk about deci, deci means a tenth. So that means a decimeter is a tenth of a meter, or there are 10 decimeters in 1 meter. And you can think of that kind of like a dime and our dollars. You need 10 dimes per dollar, just like you would need 10 decimeters per meter. We'll deal with the prefix centi often this year, and centi means a hundredth. So if we have a centimeter, okay, we've got 100 centimeters per meter. And again, we can think about that like our money system. We've got 100 cents per dollar, just like we've got 100 centimeters per meter. Okay, we've got our prefix milli, which means 1,000th. So a millimeter is 1,000th of a meter, or there are 1,000 millimeters for every 1 meter. We've got micro, and micro is 10 to the negative 6th of a basic unit. And we've also got nano, which we'll see a few times this year, and that's 10 to the minus 9 of our basic unit.